Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much for your time this morning. This is an interview that's been a long time coming, so I'm so happy that we have been finally able to sync our schedules and sit down. Let's just jump straight into it. Let's start off with a little bit of a retrospective. This is pretty much 80% of your first term in office complete. So I wanted you to give me your perspective of how you've done so far. What are the highlights of your first term? What are the low points? Just in a brief assessment of how you think you're doing.
Well, unfortunately for me, my term is going to be, I think, defined by BC and AC, before COVID and after COVID. So if I can maybe start with the before COVID part of it, I was very lucky that as a former minister in a cabinet, that I had a very good sense as to what to expect. And certainly the time that I spent in opposition, first of all, being involved in the restructuring of the party and then taking over the leadership of the party, that we spent that time really actually putting together both an economic and social development plan for the country. So probably very different than a lot of other countries and even parties, that our manifesto really is actually a blueprint of what we wanted to be able to achieve. I think that also because I was Director of Tourism, I was Minister of Tourism, I was in the Ministry of Planning, certainly in terms of how government works was a critical experience for me, because in terms of realistic expectations as to how fast things would happen, that's where that really helped me. Because, sadly and understandably at the same time, things don't happen fast in government. Government's very different to a business in that sense, and that a business that the CEO or the board really drives the process because of politics and the nature of how we come into office, that there are a lot of protocols and procedures that are put in place to ensure that there is not victimization or politicization of the system. So that slows down the ability to make things happen very fast. And because of that, when I came in, the first thing, if you remember what we did, is we really changed the structure of the ministries, and we created silos. And that was one thing that I really had learned in my previous years in government, that sometimes if you divide the government up too much, it creates silos. And the level of coordination and communication that you would expect colleagues in a cabinet, it just doesn't happen. There's a lot of turf fighting, not in a negative way, it's just a natural course, and figuring out who's supposed to be responsible for what, fighting for resources. Those are difficult situations. And so we were able to minimize that by creating these silos and causing ministers and ministries to work in a more coordinated fashion, as well as now having a permanent secretary for a silo, and then deputy permanent secretaries dealing with the individual components to it, to create better coordination. Certainly I understood very clearly where we were from a financing perspective, and that we were really on a trajectory that was just not sustainable. We were not generating enough tax revenues, and I want to use a phrase here. Tax revenue is equivalent of what we call free capital. So this is money that we've earned that we don't owe anything on. And we were just not seeing the economy grow, and as a result of it, the capital, the tax revenues, were not increasing. And that certainly was a problem, because what was happening is expenses were increasing. And expenses were increasing at the fastest on debt financing. So what we were doing is continuously borrowing to pay for those deficits that we had, and the amount of interest was just growing. So in 2003, as an example, if my memory serves me right, that we were around $33 million in interest payments. And that jumped to $170 million in interest payments in 10 years, 10 to 12 years. So that's $100 million of additional expenses. And sadly, when you're paying interest, it's not investing in the country. It's not changing the capacity of the country. It's simply to pay for this deficit that you were trying to contain. And so we had a very clear plan on how we were going to deal with that, and that's why very quickly we introduced the airport tax as well as the gas tax. Simultaneously, and what seemed to be counterintuitive, is we also reduced the VAT rate. So I have to say to you that my first year was very difficult in convincing not only the technocrats here in St. Lucia, but more importantly, the World Bank and the IMF in particular, of the sense of what we were doing. So in essence, what I was being told, that if in fact we reduce, or if we increase the airport tax, which we were taking from $25 to $98, that would cause a reduction in tourism arrivals. That if we lowered the VAT rate, that would reduce the government revenue by about $55 million. And if we increase the gas tax by $1.50, that would create inflation. So it was a stalemate in terms of the discussion. And I remember specifically, many hours with the World Bank, at the World Bank offices. And I am talking about 4-hour meetings of going back and forth, that I was able to finally say, okay, what the government will do is in its first year, it won't spend that money. So the increased amount of money we're going to get from the airport tax, the money that we're going to get from the gasoline tax, we will hold that in abatement and we will not assign it anywhere. And that if you are right, that we have monies to make up for the shortfall in the VAT rate. Okay? And by March or April of 2017 or 2018, that all of a sudden I got a phone call, and it was from my very good friend of mine from the IMF to say, okay, we apologize because tourism arrivals increased by 11%. The VAT reduction was only to $15 million, and there was no inflation. And he said to me, how did you know that? I said, because the airport tax, most of the persons coming here are tourists. They have no idea what the ticket price is, because they're paying for a ticket and they're also paying for accommodation.
The package deal.
It's a package deal. And they're buying 7 nights, minimum. Some people are buying 10, some people are buying 14. So if you take that additional $73 and amortize it over that period of time, it's insignificant. 2 cups of coffee a day. So on an airline ticket and a hotel package, which is in excess of $2,500, $73 is a minuscule amount. And it's going to have zero impact on a person's decision financially as to whether they're going to come to St. Lucia or not. I said, secondly, that the reduction in the VAT rate would compensate for the increase in the price of the fuel price in terms of inflation. So said, so done. And also, we were very certain in our own mind. I mean, all political parties, when they come in, they're very certain about certain things. In this case, we were very certain that we felt that the country had reached a point of what we call diminishing returns with taxation. Any additional tax that you were going to put on, you would not see equivalent or more of an increase in revenue, because people were just tax exhausted in the country. And so when we gave back the 2.5%, there were people, the people didn't feel it. Well, government can't dictate to each of the businesses how they use the reduction. If you are in a very competitive business, that you will see that most of that would have been passed to the consumers. If you are in businesses that we call oligopolies or monopolies, what they will do is they'll probably add it to their bottom line, but then that comes back to government in the form of corporate tax. And that's exactly what happened. So corporate tax revenue went up to 90 million from 70 million. So in essence, when you added up all of the different taxes, it more than compensated for the loss of the 15 million that we had from the. So the fundamentals were right. And then critical to that, Janeka, is that the airport tax was divided. So $35 was put into a lockbox of the increase in the $73. A portion was assigned towards the sinking fund, and so that was going into the sinking fund. So for the first 2 years, we actually put in an equivalent of about $24 million into the sinking fund. And then the third part was being used for the development of the village tourism and marketing of tourism. So the money was assigned very specifically to causes. The gas tax, which generated around $30 million, was used to help secure the funding from the Taiwanese for the road loans. And so we have a 5-year moratorium. So in the first 5 years, we were using it to catch up. The roads were in deplorable condition, particularly from a maintenance perspective. And so here we now all of a sudden going from spending about $1.5 million a year on road maintenance to as much as $15-16 million a year. And that was huge. The cleaning of the side of the road. So previously, they would have this nice program where 3 times a year they would hire a whole bunch of people to cut the grass on the side of the road. We didn't think that benefited either side. And so basically we now put in $3.5 million a year, and we assign out contracts on the main roads, and that they're being done on a monthly basis for the most part. So that's where the money went in initially, and that was a significant change. So the first part of our mission was to try to stabilize the country from a financing basis, and we did that. So we're not in jeopardy of continuing to see large deficits, and that we created our own capital source. And let me explain that. So most governments, when they come in, would depend on the World Bank and the IMF to borrow monies to be able to stimulate the economy and to fund our capital projects. And I have to tell you, both sides will tell you, difficult. The governance structures that are in place never allows this to take place with any kind of immediacy. And we were arguing that with climate change, there was an absolute need to move quicker. Hurricane season is coming upon us every year. And these were some of the points that we were continuing to argue out there. So let's take the British. When Cameron was Prime Minister, he gave a contribution of £330 million to the Caribbean, of which St. Lucia's portion was just over £30 million. We're only going to get to see the money being spent for the first time, maybe in about 6 to 8 weeks' time. 7 years. 3 prime ministers have come in since then. Crazy, right? Because it went through the CDB and all these processes that they have to be able to get this thing done. And we're sitting here going, and I used to, when I met Boris Johnson when he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs first, and it was just after Hurricane Maria, and he was attempting to get money for Anguilla and BVI, and I was laughing at him. I said, I want to see how you're going to do this trick. And he goes to me, what do you mean? I said, well, you have to use ODA funds, Overseas Development Agency funds. He said, yes. I said, well, all those countries have already graduated. You can't use any of your ODA monies for those countries, right? Because of the
income level or
per capita GDP, right? These countries were in excess of 30,000 per person, right? So how are you going to do that? And it was funny because UK was the hardest advocate at the OECD, holding on to that position. And all of a sudden now, Theresa May and him had to go back now and fight for a reversal. Now, sadly, they made amendments specifically to their case, but there has been no permanent decision as to how we're going to deal with that. Because as you know, the small island developing states are arguing that we should use a vulnerability index to determine our access to ODA monies. So if you had to depend on the traditional sources of monies to make capital projects, we would be handcuffed. So by creating now these dedicated revenue streams, the airport tax and the gas tax, it generated about $100 million a year available to us now to go out and secure financing. So the airport financing is being secured on the basis of the lockbox. The road financing is being secured on the basis of the gas tax. And these are important initiatives because I don't want to say they run outside of government, but they run outside of government's consolidated fund. These are not monies that come into the consolidated fund. They're completely accounted for because they have to go into the lockbox. And they're assigned specifically to those loans. And it means you can get the capital investment.
Ask you a question of clarity here, because I understand what you're saying, that you are using these dedicated sources of revenue to give your financing partners the confidence that you would have revenue to service the financing for the road projects and all of the other capital projects. But are the after the moratoriums expire, the grace periods expire, do you expect the monies in these various dedicated funding streams to be able to cover the payments for these projects? Because of course, as you said, you don't want to get into a scenario where you're borrowing to pay down on your financing costs. So you need to have that cash, that revenue, to be able to service the debt. Is this what you are projecting? Is this what your finance team is projecting, that the lockbox money, the airport tax money will be sufficient to service these?
Absolutely. The people wouldn't have lent us the money otherwise.
Okay.
And this is why it became very difficult when we had the first shutdown, and there was this clamor to say, go and take the money from the lockbox. It wasn't our money to take. The loan, the condition of the loan is that you have a lockbox. In order that if there was a day like what we had, that there would be money to pay for it. So in fact, there's enough money in the lockbox currently to fund the loan for another 3 years. That's the security that they wanted. And again, when the person travels, and it's important to understand the mechanism. When the person travels, an entity called IATA is the one that collects the monies on the ticket. And there's a letter to IATA that assigns that money to an account directly. So this is not our money to touch. And so they have put the models in place to look at the projections of arrivals, what possibly could be the worst case scenarios, and therefore to always ensure that that money is there. Built into the loan agreement is also climate change resilient amendments, meaning if there was a catastrophic event in the country, that the loan would be suspended until the all clear has been given.
And this is referring to which loan?
All the loans we're doing.
All of them?
Yeah, we have to really thank Grenada. Grenada really was the first country that came out of that. So when they went through their restructuring, and also given the hurricanes that they've had in the past, that this was a new clause now that was added. And this is something that all the small island developing states are putting in, because imagine what the problem was. So the deal that we did, or the transaction we just did with CDB, is in fact what has normally happened. So I remember speaking to the Prime Minister of Dominica after their very devastating hurricane. And he goes, can you imagine CDB approached me to give me a loan to pay for the interest payments and principal payments for the next year. So you were having to borrow money to pay for money. Yeah? But that was the only way that CDB could do it. CDB's laws would not allow it to suspend the loan. So in moving forward, a lot of our new loans now include that clause that when there is a catastrophic event, that the loan is suspended moving forward. So in answering your question, the first part really was to stabilize the economic recovery of the country, and what we, from a financial perspective, and then now we started to see the economic return. The other big part of coming in was really starting to convince everybody else within government what is it we were attempting to do. I always say that when you go to a meeting, it's very important to ask yourself, what's the finish line? And I always make a joke is that if we go in and say we're in a race, you may think that we're running 100 meters. I may think we're running 800 meters. Another person may be thinking that we're running a marathon. And if you think of it, the terminologies that we would use would be exactly the same. It would not be until very late in the game, if we've not established what race we're in, that we all of a sudden realize, whoa, we're all at a different position here. So when I talk about establishing what the finish line is, that was what was happening in the first part of what we were attempting to do. And so the question becomes, how do you solve this deficit problem in St. Lucia, both from a financial perspective, but more importantly, from a quality of life? Because really that's what a government's supposed to be doing, is improving the quality of life and creating the opportunity for people of its citizenry. And I don't think that St. Lucia has been doing that very well. Certainly not from a quality of life, and certainly not giving people that leg up that they would need. So you can look at the healthcare system, you could look at the education system, you could look at security, which were three that we were really focusing on. And then now you can get into economic opportunity. So there is no plan that I have ever seen that creates a viable model that allows us to achieve all those things at the current GDP rate. So if the GDP is what it is, and means it's going to generate the revenue that we have, and the only way that it can generate more revenue is by increasing the rates. And whether you think solutions are willing to pay a higher taxes proportionally what they're paying right now.
Let me pause you there, because I think this is a very interesting philosophical question, and I know that it is something that economists worldwide tussle over and fight over, and that is raising GDP rates or raising government revenue, two different things but related, either via increased collection or increased economic activity. So,
or a combination,
or of a combination of the two, and it's really a maximization problem, right? Mm-hmm. How do you get the most out of those two tools? So where do you fall on that spectrum of philosophy in terms of, you know, pumping money into certain sectors that are undercapitalized to get more economic activity so that you can increase the tax base without having to increase the tax rate, vis-a-vis leaving the economy structurally pretty much how it is, and then tweaking the tax rates to get more private sector investment, or, you know, raising revenue that way? But where would you say that you fall on that spectrum?
I don't have a philosophy. I deal with what the facts are. You know, so
that's interesting.
Yeah, I'm a pragmatist to the bone. You know, and I keep saying to people that I think I am where the world is going, and I think that that's becoming an accepted norm, where you have a conservative policy basis, but you have a social conscience. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I get teased a lot. Oh, you're a businessman, you're in government, and you can't run a business, you can't run a government like a business. Well, the principles, the organizational principles, are the same. You know, private sector has shown the management of scarce resources and to produce a more positive output. They've been much better at that. But in terms of measuring your success, a business is going to measure its success by how much money it's made and how much its share value is. From a government, in my opinion, is the quality of life and the creating the opportunity. So I mean, everybody understands that, but you don't have to be a business person not to know that. So how do you maximize the output of government, which is how do we improve the quality of life? And what's the quality of life? It's the availability of services. We talk about a globally competitive education system. That's a goal of ours. Not just education. Education by itself means what? People can read and write. Is that sufficient? We know that where we are, that we're always going to be seeing foreigners coming here to compete. And we also know that solutions are traveling abroad. And so the education system must put them in a position to compete on a global basis. The fundamental argument about healthcare. There are persons who believe in universal healthcare. Okay? My party believes in affordable quality healthcare. We don't think that a small island like this can provide universal healthcare. The cost is just enormous. Just can't carry it by ourselves. So putting in a health insurance program where government now is agreeing that we'll pay the salaries of the work of the doctors and the nurses and the administrators, we'll pay for the utility, and we'll pay for all capital expenditures. But the actual service that you're getting now will be done through an insurance mechanism, of which your business will make a contribution and you personally will make a contribution. Very similar to NIC, or like what you're doing with your current insurance, but not enough people are insured. Now, if government makes that compulsory and you now have 180,000 people participating in the insurance scheme, the amount of money you have available to fund it becomes much, much, much better. And you can work out what that number is. So depending on how much people are going to contribute will determine the level of services we have. But there are some huge benefits of doing that. Once you now have an insurance program in place in which people can go to a doctor, everybody. And if we do the Taiwanese model, and they were just talking about it in the States, in Taiwan, within 48 hours of you going to a doctor's visit, your general information is put into statistics. So we now know what the health of the nation is. When I say the health of the nation, that's what I mean. How many people are pre-diabetic? How many people are advanced diabetic? How many people have blood pressure problems? And generally the state of the country. And it also means that when you're now implementing policy and programs, you immediately can see what the impact is. So we know, mathematically and economically, that the two biggest costs to healthcare in this country is dialysis and high blood pressure. These are what we call living issues, lifestyle issues, right? People can change their lifestyle. And if we have programs that are making that happen, then what means is the money that would have been going out to cover these people now is available. So one of two things can happen. We can then reduce the premium and maintain the level of services that we currently have, or we can increase the number of services that we're providing and keep the premium at the same spot. So going back to your original question, what's my philosophy? My philosophy is exactly what we propose to sit down and do. What are the numbers telling you? Okay, the numbers are telling you that your GDP is just about $4 billion. And that, is that where St. Lucia's GDP should be? What's your potential? Because if in fact you've reached your potential, then it means you need to work backwards. Okay? If you have not even come close to reaching your potential, then the possibility of growing is there. So luckily for us, how do you figure that out? Now, I try not to fight or swim upstream too often. I'm not always very good at it, okay? And I try to speak a language that people will understand. So it's amazing to me that people understand the difference between a good farmer and a bad farmer. Pretty much in St. Lucia. Maybe a little bit less today than they did before, but certainly. But nobody knows the difference between a good hotelier and a bad hotelier. Nobody knows the difference between some of the other businesses as well. And what was it in the language? So the language was that if a farmer is producing bananas and he's producing 8 tons per acre, everybody knows that that's a Lapo farmer. Okay, he's not going to be able to make it. And if you're upwards of 20 tons per acre, you're now getting into the realm of excellence. And that people really can't see how, given our topography, the size of lots that we have, the lack of mechanization, how we can actually get past that number. Although there are people pushing harder and harder. So I took the same thing and I said output per acre. And it's an amazing revelation in that when I start measuring businesses based on output per acre, because the one input that you have, which is land, can't create any more land of. I mean, obviously DSH is trying to do that, but it's on a very small basis. You can't produce more land. So it means it's that output per acre of maximizing what your potential is. So what I did is I took Aruba, Barbados, BVI, Cayman, Nassau, not Bahamas, and Barbados. Looked at their current GDPs, looked at the population, looked at their per capita GDP, and then now at their physical size. And what I did is I added one more ratio. So for instance, in the case of Aruba, 106,000 population, GDP of 2.65 billion, a per capita GDP of 25,000, and square miles, 70 square miles. So if you take the 70 square miles and you divide it into the 2.65 billion, what that gives you is output per square mile. Mm-hmm. So Aruba's output per square mile is $38 million. Barbados' output per square mile is $30 million. Nassau's is 100. Cayman Island is 47 million. St. Lucia is 9. 9. Huge difference. If I take Aruba's per capita GDP of 25,000, multiply it by our population, the GDP should be 4.5 billion. Our GDP is 2.2 billion. You look at Aruba, what is it? 15,000 hotel rooms. No financial services, no manufacturing, no agriculture, right? St. Lucia is 4,500 hotel rooms. So you have to ask yourself the question, okay, St. Lucia has agriculture, it has manufacturing, it has a financial service sector. If in fact we brought 15,000 hotel rooms into St. Lucia, would it displace any of those industries? Does it displace agriculture? Does it displace manufacturing? Does it displace offshore financial services? In fact, we see it doesn't. We actually see that it augments all of those things, because now the farmers have 3 times the market, local market, that they had with the tourism sector. We see that airlines coming in helps support financial services. Right? We see from a manufacturing perspective that it creates a greater demand for the country. So if we go to Barbados and we look at where their GDP numbers are and what is it we can do, offshore financial services, secondary home markets, the huge investment that they had of high-end villas are really what has been promoting the Barbadian economy, and a very subsidized manufacturing sector. Now, whether that's good or bad, that's a different model analysis we have to do. So the fact is, Janeka, is that I am of the mindset that St. Lucia is grossly underperforming. And so the question you have to ask, and that's now what the challenge that I put to the technocrats is, okay, if we know that St. Lucia's GDP should be really in a minimum $4.5 billion and probably upwards of $6 or $7 billion, right? What would we have to do? What is preventing St. Lucia from doing that? What's the constraints? But the first thing you must do is, what are the sectors that you know that can produce the output per acre to be able to generate that kind of economic activity? So we know hotel industry, we know manufacturing, we know agriculture, we know offshore financial services, and there are obviously some new markets that are coming in. The orange economy, I think, grossly underestimated, and certainly how you measure it is also going to be very interesting. So we said, okay, tourism is going to be a key sector. We're underachieving in tourism. 4,500 rooms, tough. I mean, there are hotels in Vegas that are more than 4,500 rooms. There are hotels in New York City that are larger than 4,500 rooms. It's just not enough.
But let me stick a pin in that for a second, PM, and ask you if you know how much of the gross GDP figures of the countries that you cited stay in those countries. How much of Aruba's GDP stays in Aruba, is enjoyed by Arubans, and contributes to the quality of life in Aruba? Because when you look at St. Lucia, for example, a lot of our hotel rooms are owned by foreign direct investment consortiums or owners. So you have a situation where you have a high amount of leakage. So as much GDP as St. Lucia produces, if a significant quantity of that is leaving the island, then adding more to that industry is not necessarily going to be a great ROI. Yes, we're going to get some more money, but we're not capturing the vast majority of that. So do you think at this point in our development that it is a better idea to go about expanding our various industries, or is it more efficient or effective to concentrate on reducing leakages? So anything that comes in, or any new projects or programs, see how best we can grow local entrepreneurship, local manufacturing, locally owned agro-processing, to make sure that the GDP growth really comes back to benefit us?
This is a question that's been asked a lot, okay? And there's so many different answers I can give, so my head's spinning in terms of which one to be able to share with you, because I find that very often when I answer that question, people think that I'm overly defensive of tourism and that I somehow believe that tourism is the solution to everything. I don't. But the comparative advantage that we have globally is in tourism. There's no two ways about it. And the question is that Sir John always used to say, can't say it in Creole as well as he could, but it's a pharmaceutical knife. I think couteau pharmacie is the term that they would use. And it is how you use the knife, right? So it can either be used to make medicine or it could be used to kill somebody. And tourism is, in many ways, is that analogy. So I remember saying to Sir John that what was the year that bananas produced the greatest amount of output for the country? And I think it was like either the late 80s or early 90s when that happened. And I showed him that the gross amount of what bananas was producing was less than the total amount of salaries that tourism was paying. So you would have to admit that the salaries stay in St. Lucia. Just that. So tourism is a portal. Okay? It's a portal to the world. What are we getting? You're getting a person who's willing to pay their airfare, pay to come and stay in accommodation, to experience your culture. So to try to market Chairman's Rum, or to market our bananas, or Bagshaws, or any of the products that we have that we're trying to sell here on the global market, much more difficult. So when a person comes down to St. Lucia, vacations in St. Lucia, and has Chairman's, there is a bubble, a memory bubble, a happy memory bubble that's created in their mind. And when they go to the grocery store, if they had not been to St. Lucia, you think they would have seen the Chairman's bottle? No way. They're going to see Mount Gay, they're going to see the Puerto Rican Bacardi, okay, but not Chairman's.
So you're saying that you can use tourism as a marketing driver for the other on-island industries.
Right. So the classic example, okay, people who've been in meetings with me, I always give them this example. Tortuga rum cake. You know it?
One of my favorite.
Okay. Do you know how it started?
I don't know if I should say that on air.
That's okay, but you know how it started?
No.
So it was a Jamaican guy. He and his wife moved to Cayman. The wife had a job. He couldn't get a job. You know, there's some difficulties in Cayman in that regard. And he remembered his mother's rum cake recipe. And so he went to a hotel and got them to agree to sell his rum cake. And he came up with that octagonal box cake. And it went from one hotel to multiple hotels. And before the internet, that's how far back Tortuga rum cake started, was mail ordering. So all the business people who were coming in and out of Cayman loved it. And so what they were doing is they would sell it to their friends for Christmas or for their birthdays, and it became a thriving business. And eventually the business got into the duty-free shopping. He then got into the duty-free shopping on the ships, and then he got duty-free shopping on airports globally. So the point here is he started off exclusively dependent on one hotel. Then he became dependent on a multiple of hotels in Cayman. Then he became dependent on the Caribbean, and now he is a global company and completely independent and divorced from the hotel sector. Still does his business very, very well, but the fact is that's where it starts. And so he's a great example of how to use your tourism market. And that's why even to say to the young guys that when they're going to play their songs, you know, play some of your original music. Test it out on the clients at the hotels. See how they're reacting to it. So I don't want to jump here, but there's a really great book, if you've not read it, called Outliers by
Malcolm Gladwell?
Malcolm Gladwell, one of my favorites. And the first story was about the Beatles, right? Being in Amsterdam, playing what? 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. And what was important about Amsterdam was that it was an international city. And so they developed a sound because they were playing their original music. Right? And that's what we need to do, is to understand when that tourist is here, it's a sample of a market. And it's to understand that in America, how a Northeasterner and a Midwesterner and a Westerner and a Southerner react to products are very different. So even how many people are getting tourists coming in and making that segmentation. Is it British people buying my product? Is it Canadians who are buying my product? Right? And keeping trackers of it so that when you go to the bank and say, you know what, I've been doing this product, I've been doing this jewelry, and boy, the Canadians love it. I've now been able to identify a St. Lucian who has a shop in Canada. I want to be able to now export my product to her. And here is the research as to what's been happening. So we're making a sacrifice. And what's the sacrifice? We're sacrificing sharing our beach. We're sacrificing having people from abroad come into our bars and possibly create some levels of inflation. That's the cost of tourism from an environmental perspective. But if we're not maximizing on that opportunity that we've created, then we're at loss. So how is it that that bear from Mexico,
Corona.
Corona, thank you. How is it that Corona became the biggest beer in the world? 43 million Americans a year. Tequila was considered to be the worst liquor, the bottom, worse than white rum, right? Today, tequila companies are being sold for billions of dollars because of that transition. And I can tell you, Mexico and Turkey are the two countries that I admire the most in terms of understanding that connection between manufacturing and products and services and using the hotel sector. So every time you go into a hotel room in Mexico, it's their marble, it's their linen cottons, and they're doing all these things. Now, back to your point, what are the things that we can add value in? And this is where it comes back to that question I was saying to you, what's the finish line? So in tourism, the greatest opportunity for added value is really in terms of people, services. So what we need to be doing is focusing is how can we get the salaries to go up? Because that's the input that we have. So you were talking about leakages, poultry. Everybody thinks of that as a local industry. Is it?
There's a lot of importation going on still.
A lot? I mean, where did chicks come from? Abroad. Where's the feed coming from? Abroad. So it's not food security. A lot of products that we have, very difficult. So the one thing that we have, Janeka, that's ours is intellect. Okay? And creating ideas and how to copyright those ideas. And that's why, I mean, I think that if I could ever take you on a trip, the place I would take you to would be Estonia. Estonia is just so ahead of the curve. And it started off because they were part of the Eastern Bloc. Philosophically and ideology did not meet with that. We're so happy to get out after the USSR broke down, and became number one concern became how do we protect our borders? How does a country on the border of Russia with 1.1 million people protect itself? So what it decided to do was to become a virtual country. And we're the first persons to create an e-government, down to voting. And so the idea was that it would be in a cloud, way before all of us were even thinking of cloud, and that if the country was physically invaded, the citizens of Estonia could be anywhere in the world and the country could still work because they had that kind of pride and loyalty to their country. Now, one of the benefits of that is the attitude of persons. And here's where I'm challenging our young people. So I met these young kids, and what they did is they had designed an electric scooter that could go 25 miles in one day on a charge. And what was interesting about the scooter is the scooter could be folded. So what was unique about that is you can get on a bus, bring your scooter, where you get wherever you're going to go. So take my constituency, I get dropped off at the Gap, at Deriso Gap, get off the bus. There's never really a bus waiting for you. I just unfold my scooter, I can go to Chic, and I'm gone, right? Or I come into town for the day. I can be going around all the places I want to, get back on my bus and go back to the south or go back to the north, right? So what did they do is they patented it, registered it globally, yeah, put it out to tender. And a Chinese company won the bid to manufacture it. They put out to bid the pay system, and PayPal won the system. They designed their own web platform to be able to sell the product. So here is it that this idea came from these young guys in Estonia, right? The benefit of manufacturing it's in China, the royalties they're paying is into the US for PayPal, okay? They're on a international web platform, but they've created value in their own country through the copyright, right? So sadly, the size of our country, the amount of inputs that we have to make agriculture or make other things work, we're always going to be dependent on foreign outputs. We're not producing our own fertilizers as yet, right? So every single industry in this country there's leakage. The question is, how do we maximize the return on what our component is? And that's where I would very much want to see salaries go up in the hotel sector. But guess what? What's preventing that from happening? 40 cents kilowatt hour electricity cost. So a Sandals Grand, as an example, their electricity bill on a monthly basis is about $700,000, $800,000 a month. If that hotel was in Tobago, their bill would be about $200,000 a month. If it was in Mexico, it'd be about $150,000 a month. So in economic terms, how does any business make up that amount of productivity loss? How do you make up $600,000 a month in order to remain competitive? The airfare from New York to St. Lucia is $1,000. The airfare from New York to Jamaica, $450. The airfare from New York to Mexico, $350. Okay? The hotel here has to make up that competitive disadvantage. How do you reduce the airfare? By getting greater volume. How do you have to get more volume? You have to have more rooms. There's no other mathematical or science, there's no mystery to all of these different things. And the question is, what's the number of rooms in which it allows you to get the highest potential rate that can pay people the highest salaries? That's how I measure our potential return. Genuinely, and to your point, and this is where the great opportunity is that authentic tourism. And everybody goes, oh, what's authentic tourism? It's defined by each country as to what that authenticity is. So the project we're doing in Sandy Beach is the beginning of that. And when we talk about village tourism, is creating land in a viable economic space, affordable to St. Lucians to be able to buy. So a person who was a rooms division manager, I don't want to be there anymore. I'm going to go and run my own little guest house. Person who was a chef, want to run my own restaurant. Okay? You have all these people now with years of experience, but don't have that capital to make that level of investment. And so what we want to do is create a company called Village Tourism Incorporated. General manager, accounting, human resource, interior decorating, safety and security. We pay for that. And so they become part of this franchise in which we help them with their guidelines, and we take that pressure off of them. But we know that the better way is if they're in fact earning profit. They're going to get paid the greatest amount of money. And so these are the things we're constantly looking at, to your point, is not so much focusing on what the leakage is, but focusing on what we actually do here and how we can create more value. So in Sir John's days, the argument was, don't let hotels borrow money from our local banks. Right? Now, wow. A bank makes money by lending money. So here's the biggest industry in your country, and you're depriving your local banks from participating in that sector. And so that they're not making money. And so here you are making all these sacrifices, but you're not actually looking at what the linkages are and how we could make that happen. So that's really the answer to your question.
Now, this brings us, I think, to a good point where we can look at the current situation, right? BC and AC. We're now firmly in the AC portion of our existence. Tourism is an industry that we have seen can evaporate overnight. So I take the point that you're saying of making sure that we're maximizing the revenue from that. But when the revenue is zero, what do? It looks to me, and of course you need to correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks to me that our short-term economic strategy is to do our capital works program, which obviously is going to stimulate the economy because you have everybody out working, doing construction, and also to try to get back to some kind of industry with tourism as safely as possible. Now, in light of the recent economic data coming out of the US, I think everybody was flabbergasted by those Q2 numbers. It was shocking, scary. You know, I can only imagine what is being talked about in all of these high-level, forums. Is this a strategy that can work for us if our main source market is looking so shaky? Have you had to reevaluate the approach, and what does that look like?
So, before I answer that question, let me just say to you, as we bridge the gap between BC and now AC, the final part of BC was the midterm strategy. Because what we said is that we need to grow. And we identified the airport, the roads, water, cost of electricity or cost of doing business in general, the efficiency of government are all as major constraints from preventing the country from growing.
So that was the outcome of the deliberation. Do we need to work backward, or can we grow forward and we can grow?
And it's both.
Okay.
So the fact is that the efficiency within government, horrible, right? We know that an e-platform will be much, much more efficient. And it deals with transparency and corruption, because when there's too many hands involved in a process, and I don't want to pick on any one department, so to get a document, okay?
You don't have to tell me that.
Okay, to get a document, take a line, make an application form, and you always leave there wondering whether this is actually a fair process. Because all of a sudden somebody says to you, look, it's going to take you 6 weeks, so I don't have 6 weeks, and somebody says, well, you know, if you help me out, I can get it faster. And it's always amazing to me that how fast it can get done. Okay? And there are many documents that you and I know that if you're willing to do that, it gets done. The e-government platform changes that. So let's look at the driver's license as a classic example. You go online, you make your application, you pay your money online, and you simply pick up your card. Big difference. Registering companies, registering land, birth certificates, passports, registration of companies. Pinnacle, which has a online registration form for IBCs, International Business Group, 15 minutes. Local company, 3 to 6 weeks. You're going, how does that happen? Why can't I get that? Now imagine that when we start getting to that level of efficiency, how much easier. Why does it take in most countries 6 hours to get a container off the ship into your backyard? Here it's in excess of 72 hours. That's money. Processes, application forms. So going now to the single window system, where it's the same way you have a person's arriving on an advanced passenger list, you have now an advanced container list. So it's all documented electronically already, your duties are calculated, and then you do spot checks. Big difference in terms of how we're going to do that. So we focused on some critical areas. We said education, healthcare, agriculture, tourism, infrastructure were all critical components and the e-platform. So now that we get into AC, one of the first things we did is said, okay, boy, let's reassess our midterm strategy very quickly, because I don't want to be wasting resources if in fact the new normal is not going to. Guess what? It only told us that we were absolutely on the right track. All of the things were as important BC as they were AC, before Corona and now after Corona. So that was a huge relief. And I'm telling you, I didn't go in there with the expectation to get those results. And it's not just Allen Chastanet going in, IMF, World Bank, our delivery unit, all these entities went in, made the assessment, said, absolutely on the right track. So the question now is, what's the new normal? And how we're going to be able to take advantage of this new normal. And you're 100% right. When you hear that the United States is on trajectory to see a 32% decline in its GDP, you go, wow. Wow. You know? But on the other hand, Canada is seeing, after going into the largest deficit of its history, is seeing a quicker response, a quicker rebound. The job losses in the United States are jobs that can come back much faster. Do we believe for 1 minute that all those jobs are coming back? No. And this is where now a bit more in-depth analysis is needed. Was J.C. Penney's in trouble BC?
Absolutely.
Lord and Taylor's.
All of these brick and mortar.
Broken model. You could see that the online stuff. I mean, my wife, a classic example. You know, I saw the resistance early on, many years ago, to going online. Now that she understands the sizes and she becomes familiar with how to analyze the stuff, and that you can order it, you can try it on. If you don't like it, you put it back in a box and you send it back to them. Right? She is not going back to any store. How many solutions I'm seeing that, forget that. So that's an industry that was not salvageable. If I look at an example here, it's heartbreaking. Liat. Liat was on the ropes before. All COVID did was just cement the deal. And there are going to be businesses in St. Lucia. Go to the shopping malls, the stores that were in there. You think that many of them are coming back? I don't think so. But some of those stores were in trouble already because people were buying stuff online. And so let's not be overzealous in blaming COVID. There was already a significant change. And people fight change. You know that. Hard. And it's not until, finally it hits them. The sad reality, it's all happening at once. And there's going to be this caveat. So how does that affect St. Lucia? I was involved at Windjammer Landing when we had the Gulf War. And literally the world stopped for 3 months, particularly tourism. I was at the helm of marketing and sales at Air Jamaica for 9/11. And we saw the airline industry in the Western world shut down for 12 days, right? And then we saw the pick back up. I was Minister of Tourism when we were dealing with the financial crisis. Fastest recovering industry every single time, tourism. Tourism's gotten to the point where it's a lifestyle. It's not a luxury good anymore. All these people who are locked up in their homes for COVID, I speak to many, just can't wait to get out, right? We saw in 9/11, the thing was fair to travel. And that's why you now saw all these security reforms. And we were at Air Jamaica and we put together the most amazing campaign from what? From all the persons that were calling their loved ones when they knew they were going to die. And those stories were being played. So everybody lived those stories. And so what happened was value of time with family. And there was this massive resurgence of business that came in that area. Friends going out on vacation together, families going out on vacation together. During the recession here in St. Lucia grew the fastest in the Caribbean, had the fastest recovery. And I think we asked ourselves the question, who are we? Because when you're going into a crisis with huge amount of competition, you must know who you are. So are we tourism? No, tourism is a generic word. We said that we are romantic tourism. And why romantic tourism? Because persons who are going to go on a honeymoon or a romantic trip, money don't matter. A honeymoon is once in a year, once in a lifetime event, supposed to be. And they're, regardless of what their financial situations, they're going to spend that money. Versus somebody who's going on a family annual vacation, if the economy is not so great, they go,
right.
I'm going to have. So what we did is we focused our marketing strategy on romance. And we got The Bachelor to come here. And if you go back and look at the records, St. Lucia's US arrivals went up by 30%. Nobody else even had growth, simply by being ahead of the curve. The Caribbean is 1.5% of global tourism, 4.5% of US tourism. And St. Lucia is only just under 1% of the Caribbean's tourism. So in absolute terms, not a big number. I keep saying this, Jamaica gets 750,000 US arrivals from the tri-state. We get 180,000 arrivals in total. So is it mathematically possible that there can be a global contraction in tourism, but that we can grow? The answer is yes. What are the things that would lead to growth? Is that the Caribbean has done incredibly well in dealing with COVID. You have another problem that's being created right now. A new Cold War is being developed. And there's a tremendous amount of insecurity and fear that's building up and going to Asia. Yeah? And so a lot of persons, I believe, are going to stay safe at home in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean, I think, is going to be a huge beneficiary, both from the UK, Canada, and the US. Another dilemma that's being developed. And again, you see, this is where our dependence on tourism, I'm really hoping that as time goes by, the same way we understand the banana sector, we start understanding the tourism sector. A strong US dollar works against us because Americans now can go more affordably to other parts of the world, and persons who want to come to us outside of America, it's more expensive. So what have you been seeing in the last couple of weeks? The dollar's been sliding. Pound is back up to $1.30. We know that the pound can get past 150, that's a huge benefit to us, not only from a tourism but also from real estate perspective. Canadians, and then even for Americans, as the dollar gets weaker, it gets more expensive for them to go to other countries, and now because we're pegged to them, we become more affordable. Is that a phenomenon we believe that's going to continue? I think so. I mean, with US elections coming in, the uncertainty with what's happening in the oil market, and all the other levels of uncertainties, and given the amount of debt that we are seeing that the US is accumulating, and the gridlock on a political basis, all those things, I think, for the most part, I could never predict 100%, but I think that the US dollar, it looks like it's going to continue to decline, and other currencies are going to strengthen. And certainly, the US still has not come out of COVID, whereas some of these other countries now are starting to recover a bit better. So I believe that tourism can do well. We just have to be very smart, like we've been in the past, as to what our strategy is going to be in terms of that recovery. But certainly this situation also opens up other opportunities. Persons have been working remotely. CEOs, chairmen of companies. And those persons who can afford to run their businesses remotely now are saying, you know what? Wow, look how St. Lucia did. Look how, the Caribbean did. I get Wi-Fi, I get air access, the places are relatively safe. Those are the things they're going to look for. And that's where now solutions hopefully will join me in understanding that our competitive advantage in bringing secondary home markets and people to work remotely are three essential things. Healthcare. So Cayman, as a country, when Cayman Health City came in, their demand went through the roof because persons, high net worth individuals, saw a quality hospital available. Security. We want to know they're safe. And thirdly, if I'm going to bring my children, I want to know that I can put my kids into an education system that works. Now guess what? What do St. Lucians want? Better quality education. They want better quality healthcare, and they want to be secure. So these are perfectly aligned. I would never do it for foreigners, but in doing it for ourselves, let's do it to a higher standard, because then now there is a spin-off.
Everybody can benefit.
Everybody can benefit.
On the more practical side of things, and this has to do with the nuts and bolts of managing an economy, we have some short-term measures that were implemented to kind of ease the pain of this crisis. So the NIC initially came out with the employment relief program that's been extended to the 6 months. There is a income support program coming from central government. There's all sorts of different programs. Looking at the world, I do not see that in 6 months we will be back to normal functioning. So what is the government's perspective? What is your strategy for when these programs run out? How do we take care of people who may still be without a job, either on layoff or made redundant? There's a lot now of excess capacity in our workforce, idled people that still have bills to pay, still have rent to make, and so on. So in the medium term, what are we going to do about this?
Great question. The analogy that I liked the most when this first happened was an economist called Paul Krugman, who is a Nobel laureate economist. And he said the world has gone into an induced coma. And it's a great analogy. So why do we put a person into an induced coma? It's because they have a brain hemorrhage or some kind of problem. We're concerned that the damage that will happen to the rest of the organs of the body while we're trying to treat that specific problem. So what they do is they put the person into a coma to be able to protect the rest of the body, focus on what the problem is, and then now once that problem is done, take the person off of life support at that point to determine whether in fact all the other organs were saved. Okay, and then you start now building back. So now you can be a bit more specific because the life threat is not there. So if all of a sudden there's a kidney malfunction because of that, they now know how they can deal with the kidney malfunction. But the person is now not out of critical care, but certainly much more stabilized in a much more manageable situation. So what was the equivalent of that? The decision where we had been working with the banks. I'd been having conversations with the governor of the central bank as early in February to say to him, Governor, it looks like we're going to have a situation where all the hotels are going to be shut. He was going, what do you mean? I said, everything's going to be shut down. And when you look at the impact of tourism in our economies and now the consequential fallout of what's going to happen, this is catastrophic. And I think that he thought maybe I was a little bit overzealous in my assessment, but as time came by, and I remember him calling me about the middle of March, saying, okay, this is going to happen. And I was able to show a model of what we thought the fallout was going to be. And even at that point, when we were asking him to support the idea of a blanket moratorium by the banks, there was a hesitancy. So it wasn't until 2 weeks later that, and I'd spoken to the banks, and we all got on a phone call together, and they said, no, too many people that are being impacted. And so to stabilize the thing, in essence, go into a coma, that was one of the things. And the government's then next role was to take the panic out. So first of all, you're not going to lose your house, you're not going to lose your car. Take that stress off of you. The second one then became, if you're going to lose your job and there's no money coming in, how do we put some money into your hands? And I kept on saying, this is not a replacement to your income. This is a subsistence allowance simply to allow you to buy basic foods. Because there's nothing going on in the country. There's no activity. It's simply just survive. Exactly how we would do with your organs in an induced coma. Just stabilize the situation. And that's why I kept on saying there was a three-phase part to this process. Now that we've done that, and rightfully so, a lot of these initial interventions are going to come to the end of September. The 6 months on. I believe that what will happen is the banks will take off the general blanket and now deal with specifics. So now all of a sudden, it's who the individuals and who the companies that's much more manageable. And everybody's had time to assess who's going to get back going, because we're seeing that retail, barbershops, hairdressing salons, we're seeing buses going, although my bus drivers are not happy about the capacity of 10, and that's an issue I have a tremendous amount of faith in the CMO. And I think that the scare that we had with the girl who was in St. Vincent hopefully gets people to understand why we're doing what we're doing. But we're seeing recovery in certain areas. The farmers were never really that much impacted because we moved very quickly. And what we knew they were going to lose in sales to the hotels, we were able to replace that by now, instead of me giving everybody $500 a month, I was terrified, my government was terrified that they would go to the grocery store, buy foreign stuff. So what we did is we bought stuff. We made sure that we bought local. And that helped solve a big problem with my farmers, my fishermen. I couldn't buy as much poultry as I wanted to. So maybe that poultry sector was affected a little bit more, but it's not a long digestion, meaning the chicks take about 6 to 8 weeks to be able to grow. So this is something that's not a significant catastrophic problem. And so they can grow based on what the future demand is going to be. We're seeing the hotel sector reopen slowly. We're very encouraged because the pre-testing is working. We've had zero problems with any tourist arriving in the last month that has tested positive. And so it will get to the point now where, okay, we're confident that pre-testing is working. That person who's pre-tested now can start going out on tours, can go to the restaurants and start circulating in the economy because we know that the protocol is working. The problem is getting the pre-test done. And if you'll notice that I've been advocating on a regular basis, I've spoken to 3 governors, we've spoken to airlines, we're speaking to financial persons, we've spoken to CVS, we've spoken to Walgreens, we've spoken to, what's the other one? Walmart. in terms of making this more available. But the problem is everybody can do the test, the swab, but they're all going to the same labs. And so we know that there's three things that are going to fundamentally change how we're doing business right now. One, if we can get a rapid test. Two, if there is a cure for COVID. Or three, if there's a vaccine. Any one of those three things, there'll be a rush. I mean, a huge sigh of relief globally. In the meanwhile, we've been trying to work with the airlines and the airports and governors to try to get a prerequisite, a mandate that anybody who's going to travel will be pre-tested. When we had written the protocols, we knew, and we'd gone through the analogy of if somebody was to be tested here, when they get tested, when they arrive here and they test positive, what do? Can't send them back home. I got to do contact tracing on the plane, right? It starts undermining people's confidence. Oh, these people are coming in. It's a problem. So, I supported, Antigua and Jamaica went away from the protocol by allowing persons to arrive to be pre-tested. Within 2 weeks, reverse a pattern. The Bahamas. The problem in the Bahamas had nothing to do with tourists. Minister, a very good friend of mine, the cabinet made a decision that they were going to allow Bahamians, because it's very close to Miami, and they were all dying to go back out shopping, to go to visit Florida for 72 hours and come back without a test. Well, in 2 twos, he had a massive outbreak in the country. So we know that there's certain principles that are required. Clearly, for full recovery, we need to see the hotel sector back up to at least 3/4 of its employment. Do I believe that in the next 6 months that the hotels will reopen and rehire everybody? No. There's going to be a very big change on how we're moving forward because nobody's expecting the occupancies. But they want to start getting their doors open in hope that one of the three things I spoke about is going to come about.
So in the meantime, what
Yes.
are the interventions?
So the interventions are construction and the call centers. So between the substantial increase in construction, absorbing manpower, the call centers, we added 1,300 new jobs. We announced 1,300 jobs over the next 4 months. And 2 of the call centers have since contacted us and are working with the CMO on the protocols that they can even bring more, right? Because what happened in Jamaica, when Jamaica panicked, how they treated the call center caused many of the companies to say, we need a backup. We don't want to put all our eggs in Jamaica anymore. And St. Lucia had been nurturing that sector before COVID, and all of a sudden, that opportunity has opened up. So I would say to you that I think that from an employment perspective, before we reach the end of the year, we're going to be relatively close to where we were from a pre-COVID basis, although not everybody is going to be back in the hotel sector. We're seeing public sector investment in that the airport, St. Jude's, the police headquarters, the roads, so the West Coast Road, we're down to the last 3 persons. They're putting in their bids in, so hopefully in the next month or so, the contractor will be announced, and it'll take that person another month to mobilize and starting the Millennium Highway. So certainly before the end of the year, you're going to see that's a $150 million project. The Japanese with the bridge contractor was selected by the Japanese. We went through 2 attempts of making that happen, and they're already in the region and they're hopefully going to get started. We have a couple of private sector projects, the Daher Mall, the Hyatt project, as well as a project in the south that look like they're still wanting to get off the ground. Cabot is continuing to move ahead, now wants to go into a more aggressive phase of their construction. So we're very lucky that pre-COVID, there was already a lot of work that was being done, all the financing was being happened, and I told you about this life cycle of how to get a project off the ground. It's all coming to fruition at the right time. You see there's a new building going in town, which is a $30 million investment. Tomorrow we're going to go and open a water project, a new water construction project in Grace. That's $70 million. The refinery is adding another $15 million US expansion. The brewery in the south is also expanding. Bryson Company is expanding. Brian Daher is doing some developments. So I think that what's going to happen, Janeka, is as people see these things are taking place, so even the cruise industry, once they heard and saw that the airport was proceeding in the south, even with their current situation, are trying to find mechanisms as to how we can continue to get the port development in the south going. So I'm encouraged. The numbers that I got to see yesterday, particularly from gas consumption, I'm shocked. You know, considering a complete shutdown literally for 6 weeks, what we all have seen in the state of the economy, in the last 6 to 8 weeks, huge increase. And we know that we don't even have our tourism sector, which is a big driver of that fuel consumption happening. So I think that what we'll see is a dissipation of some of the immediate interventions and now a focus on sectorial focus. So I think that my entertainers, hard hit. Not only hard hit financially, but I think psychologically, in the sense that this was going to be the largest carnival that we would have ever seen. I think we can all say that, yeah? I can't even begin to imagine for them that it was literally, people had bought their uniforms, the money was there in the bank account, and you knew that that was only the beginning and all the spin-offs that would have happened. So it's not just the Jazz Festival, it's Carnival, it's the Roots and Soul, it's CPL. Not here. Rented cars, people's homes, Airbnb, restaurants and bars. You can't replace that. You could never recover that. And so that sector has been hit hard. And we're going to have to look specifically at how we can try to help them through this difficult time, because sadly, it's going to take a while before we're going to see that business return to the extent it was. So I think that we're much clearer now as to which sectors are going to need the continued help, but it doesn't mean that everybody is going to need the help that they had before.
Okay. With the time that we have left, I want to maybe pull back again and just look at things on a more, a 50,000 foot level. One of the things that I noted, and I know that you say that you don't have a philosophy necessarily, but people will look at your actions and, create a philosophy for you. One of the things that you had indicated in I think it was your very first budget address, that was in 2017, was that certain state entities were not performing as they should have in your estimation, and your administration thought that the best thing to do for those entities would be to unwind, right, to close them. So we had Radio St. Lucia, we had the marketing board, which has since re-established itself. We've had the Fish Marketing Corporation, which has since moved into private hands. Is there, in your opinion, certain functions that must be funded by the government? And I'm taking the major things out: education and healthcare to a certain extent, and security to a certain extent. I guess my question to you is, why did you think that we had to get rid of these organizations from the government's books, so to speak, rather than reform, revamp, give them a new mandate, and continue to have these operating as state entities?
So sadly, there's not one answer that fits all.
Okay.
Each one is its own issue. So if you take Radio St. Lucia, we would have had to spend $8.5 million to fix the building, re-equip it, and allow it to now provide a signal around the island.
That's in Capital.
Capital.
Okay. So why not do that?
Because how many radio stations do we have in St. Lucia?
How many state broadcasters do we have?
It doesn't matter. You see, the state is time. So even when we have to be honest with each other. The last set of hurricanes we had, it wasn't Radio St. Lucia that was on air. It was Tim and a whole bunch of other radio stations with RCI and that were doing it. And the fact is they're regulated. They're all licensed and government can get time. What was missing, in my opinion, was programming. That's what was missing. So if I have to now, if the state had to invest $8.5 million, it has to get a return. We're going to go and compete against the same private sector people for a small market. And any advertising that the state gets, people say, oh, the state has an unfair advantage. We're holding them ransom on other things in order to make them the thing. Radio station has flourished.
But
I may not be always happy, but the point is, the point is it has flourished. So the key is that Radio St. Lucia technically has not disappeared. So what we've done is, if you've seen, is we've now invested that money into NTN and GIS, and the goal is that, and that's not happened yet, is to put even more money in to establish programming, and that programming now can go on to the different networks. All right. So we should have a 15-minute news piece that's a government news piece that's attached to your news piece or attached to HTS's news piece, both on TV as well as radio, in terms of better programs. So I want you to think of BBC. BBC is not known as just being as a channel. It's a producer of international shows. And I would love that capacity is in this country. They're not only producing programs for us here, but also programs for the rest of the Caribbean and possibly even for other countries in the world, because the Caribbean is a unique story. We should be the leader in tourism in terms of programming. We should be the leader in the world on climate change. How can it be that we're the most vulnerable in the world? And I'm sure you've gone around, Janeka. I go to meet students. Where's the advocacy on this whole issue of climate change?
That's kind of where I'm coming from with the idea of a state broadcaster. It's not necessarily government information, right? So it's not necessarily news coming out of central government, but it is programming, as you said, that may not necessarily be attractive to a private station because it may not be profitable. So if I'm looking at, if for example, my station, we're looking at what to cover with our limited resources, we may not necessarily feel that we should go to a school in Deriso combined, and cover their reading competition, for example.
But what I want to do, Janeka, is to cause the different channels here to know that there's a source of funds, that what the government is interested in is in programming.
Okay.
So
create that we could access
Radio
funds
St. Lucia,
to do that.
we were employing 3 times as many people, and we were paying them 3 times the salary of anywhere else. That's also competition.
Not bad. I might have applied.
You might have applied, and the thing is that there's certain things that work well within the government's system, and there are things that work. Let's take my favorite one, Victoria Hospital. So Victoria Hospital and the primary health care services work under the Ministry of Health. So the chief accounting officer for Victoria Hospital is whom?
The PS?
No.
Health?
Accountant General.
Fair enough.
Right? But the Accountant General didn't think that was the case. So I'm a business person. Right? I walk into the hospital, I meet the lady who is at the cashier, I see this big box, and I have all these receipts in it. And I go, wow, that's how many people came in here today? She goes, oh, PM, oh. I said, what do you mean? She says, no, they come and pick it up every quarter. Now, anybody who's a simple accountant, that's reconciliation. You're supposed to be doing it on a daily basis. How much money came in? How much money did you collect? How much was on credit cards? How much was on check? How much was in cash? That's basic. That you're a reagent. That was the first time I ever heard that term. It was when I went into the lab. And the lady is saying to me, PM, big problem here. I said, what's the problem? She said, we're continuously running out of reagent because what is happening is that we're ordering it always on an emergency basis. It's FedExed into George Charles Airport. It's then taken it gets here in 2 days. It's then taken to the warehouse in Bizet, and it takes 8 to 10 days to get from the warehouse to Bizet to here, and they never air condition it. So what happens is almost 50% of the reagent is being lost. Now, if you have a proper accounting system that you know what your cost should be of reagent, because based on the number of tests that you've done, so how much you've used, it doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but within a certain ballpark. No accountability.
So
they had a wonderful lady. They had a wonderful lady that was doing the blood bank. And I saw this old computer on her desk. I said to her, "What's that? It still works?" She goes, "Oh, yes." I said, "Why do you have that? It must be so easy to get a laptop." She goes, "I can't use a laptop because for years I begged to get a program to run the blood bank. I ended up doing it myself and I wrote it on DOS." So she was still using, you're probably too old, too young to remember.
I remember those.
Floppy disk, right?
Yes.
And she was taking it home every night. How does that happen? Old air conditioners, old equipment, I could never, what's it called? There's a special department, I never remember the name of it, the decommissioning agency or whatever. So if a government has an old desk or an old computer, they can't throw it away. They have to apply through this agency that has to give them permission to do it. But you would go there and half of the lab was equipment that wasn't working, right? So there's a problem in government to run things on a day-to-day basis. It's not that they're bad people, it's just system's just not set up for that. So government is a very good regulator and a big good policy maker. So what we wanted to do is to say, okay, St. Jude's works much better because it has a board and that there's more accountability on a daily basis. St. Jude's also benefited that in 2001, Mercy Hospital came in and gave them an organizational structure. So when you go down to St. Jude's in a stadium, much better run operation than Victoria, right? And that's a problem. You go around government of revenue generating and service providing agencies and they don't get it. And what happens is that in government, look at this, the same thing going around with this memo from cabinet about putting a freeze on promotions, etc. That's finance. But there's a sensitivity in government that any time that the executive overstates itself or perceived as being overstated, as being political, and it slows it down. And I get that. I understand that. I'm not upset, but that's just the nature of the business in terms of transparency and accountability and objectivity. And therefore, there are certain businesses it shouldn't be in.
But let's look at St. Jude's because it is a statutory board,
Yep.
but the government still funds salaries.
Yep.
They still purchase, all of the tools and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still, quite dependent on the state.
Mm-hmm.
I am not saying, and I think that every single St. Lucian will agree with you that efficiency and efficacy in central government is a problem for us. But then why do we, of course you have to fund a hospital, but why not have said these agencies are not functioning well, we have to do something with them, but we as a government feel that it is important to have a guaranteed market for our fishes, for example. It is important for us to have the programming, from a state broadcast perspective. It is important for us to fund our heritage and conservation organ, the National Trust. Why decide that these agencies should not get any more government funding? Even, I'm just trying to tease out that decision, because you could have said, look, I'm giving you guys 3 years to get your act together,
So let's take fisheries.
Mm-hmm.
Good example. I think it was only one time, in fact it was my father-in-law when he was at NDC, was able to make fisheries turn some bit of a profit. Again, so what's the finish line? What was the fisheries built for? Was the fisheries built to be a distributor of local fish, or was the fisheries complex built in order to export fish? Two different markets. So what was happening is that not just during my tenure, but in previous tenures, is that the fisheries complex runs as its own entity, all right? And it was buying fish at a particular price, cleaning it, and freeze blasting it, and trying to sell it at the same price it bought. Now, the cost of electricity to run the freezers, the quality of fish goes down significantly because people want fresh fish. Even the hotels want fresh fish. They don't want froze blasted fish. So there was a problem. Every year, I'll tell you the 2 times of the year. Going back to school, August, and Christmas. When the fishermen had accumulated a certain amount of payables, right, they would then cry. And they would come to the politicians. So every single year, anywhere between $2 and $3 million a year, government was getting an IOU. So fisheries companies come say, look, we can't pay the money right now. Can you lend us the money and we're going to pay you back the money? When I came in, it was $25 million. Do you think government was going to get that money back? No. And meanwhile, it's not running at a profit. And I'm not even talking about big cash balance. A profit for me would be enough money to maintain the place and continue to provide the said services. So the expectation is not like make a return on the assets you have. Couldn't even do that. When I went down to Dennery, what was I going to Dennery for? To go and see the drain. So the water level in Dennery is higher than the drain. So the guys are cleaning the fish is going into the thing, staying there, rotting and smelling out. Plus the ice making machine, not working, has not been working for years. So what they're doing is they're trucking now ice down. So the new people who've taken over took me and said, look, PM, we need to get this thing fixed. Plus, we would like to be able to get some money to be able to fix like $8,000 to fix up the ice making machine. Not to sell ice. The biggest gift I think we can give the fishermen, give them free ice. And even right now in this market, the fishermen are coming home, they're selling all the fish right there. And the middleman has grown significantly, that people are now coming with their trucks, with their ice cases, putting the fish in and going house to house and selling the fish. That's for local distribution. So what was the purpose of the fisheries complex? When they couldn't sell their fish, they would now have a market that would buy their fish. And that market was having to absorb it immediately at a loss price.
So you don't think that's worth 25 million over a couple of years? Having that kind of financial stability for the fishermen, that at least if I'm not able to get the sales, at least I have that guaranteed market, and so you're providing that income stability across a sector.
Because that's just the beginning. Remember I said to you the equipment's not being maintained. So it became millions of dollars now to continue to fixing up the place. And the bigger point is the complex was there to be able to help with an export market. How much are we exporting? Zero. Go to St. Vincent and see the thriving business that's going on there. Go to Jamaica. Millions of pounds of fish that's being exported, right? Go to Tobago. Fishermen catch the fish. They've learned how to immediately fillet it there, put it on ice fresh, straight onto FedEx, into the US market, right? That business is not here. And our fishermen, who very hardworking guys, right, don't want to get into this longer term business, which means they got to go out for days, the types of boats that they have. How long you've been hearing this conversation going on, right? So the purpose of bringing now a private group is to give it some new thought process. So let's just look at the facility here. They're cleaning up the bathrooms, they're cleaning up the building, and now saying, look, let's put a fish fry here, let's integrate and create more economic activity. Why is it that government couldn't do that? Why is it that the board that was sitting there couldn't do that? It's just because the mindset is just totally different. And so the asset is not coming to its productive use. If in fact we want to increase the GDP of the country, all of your output areas have to increase substantially. So it's not just about maintaining what that is. Sure, for $2.5 million, no problem. But it's not sustainable. The building is deteriorating, okay? And the main purpose of having it is to generate foreign exchange, create more money coming into the economy, because you talked about adding value. Where's that added value coming in? Them catching the fish, right? And so we've got to change that. But unfortunately, what was happening is everybody was seeing the fisheries complex as a last market dumping ground. And then they go there, they couldn't sell the fish, and they were expecting now the fisheries complex to be able to sell it. And who is the fish? They're not getting enough fish to get into the export market. And the moment they freeze blast it, zero value. Because what they would be able to sell freeze blasted fish for on the international market, and by the time you include the transportation, Janeka, there is no valid business that's there. The lottery, classic example. So we have a lottery that was designed to do what? Our lottery was designed to run the lottery, to regulate the lottery, and to collect the money. Well, what's our lottery doing? They're not doing the inspections that they should of the VIN machines. You go there, they have some staff, but it's not to the extent that it should be. But most of the time is now being spent on funding what? Programs for youth and sports. But they're not designed to do that. So I'm sitting here and saying, okay, let's take the regulatory component of the lottery, move it into the gaming authority, because that's what that entity does. And we only have one casino on island, so it means to amortize the staffing and to build it up in that capacity there. You're now going to have online betting with the horse racing, and you're going to have betting there, so that industry is growing. So allow that to be the regulator, and now create what? A youth and sports authority. And when persons work in those structures in which they can be compensated for the job they're doing, the regulations in the civil service are too confining. Commerce and trade. How do you have trade in a government structure? What I want is I want young, aggressive people who go out and say, Bryce, you're now doing these, manufacturing these water tanks. What markets are you looking at? You say, well, I've only looked at this, and say, well, look, we think there's a market over here, and we think there's a market over here, and they've got the contacts. The agricultural food products, our manufacturers, macaroni, etc., that there's a team of people that are working with these people to now generate new markets. Windfresh. Why is it Windfresh was only in the banana business? Why wasn't Windfresh being used as an output to yam and dasheen, and now creating a market directly to our diaspora in London? And if that worked, why can't we recreate it in Toronto and recreate it in the tri-state area? Right? And that these people are being paid a basic salary plus incentives. But when you're in government, get paid a salary, regardless of how things go, whatever. And then there's so many restrictions on how you can deal with the commercial market. And so I just want to say to you again, if the goal is really to expand the GDP, you have to look at all of these different elements. They're all separate in terms. The printry. You go in there. People were teasing me when I went in to see them. They said, oh, you're only coming in now. I said, well, did you know that the first project I worked on when I was an economist was the printry? 1985. Okay, and I can guarantee you the document I wrote in 1985 still applicable today. It's the same building. So what's the main product that the printry does?
Gazette.
The Gazette. How many gazettes do they print on a weekly basis?
I don't know. I get mine online.
400. And to your point, do they need to print 400? I think they need to, in my mind, print one for the archives and then send it online to everybody else. And if you want to print it at your cost. Right? You go there are school books that have the rules in it. Yeah? Every school is doing their own thing. Ministries have an allocation for printing. When they exhaust the money that they have and which they spend in the private sector, guess what do? They then turn to the printry to try to do it at the last minute. So when I go around, most of the ministries, the person that is managing their printing work for them, guess who it is?
I don't know. I'm hoping that it's not somebody too senior.
Well, then you'll be very happy. Generally a secretary.
Okay.
You know? So the difference between 4 colors, 5 colors, and 2 colors, the difference between 8.5 by 11, understanding what the timeline of printries are, when's the best time to ask them to be able. So if I have something that's not time sensitive, okay, and I know I'm going to be doing it every year, calendars, there's a whole bunch of things that we print that we know we're going to do it. So the goal now is to create a new printer unit that actually is a technical team that helps them in sourcing. So they help them with the design, putting out the quotes in terms of getting the job done. But we don't need a printery. We don't. There are plenty of private sector printers here. And what government must also understand, its role in terms of supporting that private sector. Government contracts help significantly in helping smaller businesses become medium-sized businesses. Medium-sized businesses now all of a sudden are in a position to be able to compete regionally. So when we fight, we fight hard with international agencies to get that local companies can get the contract. So let's take the West Coast Road. When I meet Prime Minister Johnson, I'm going to say to him, guess what? After we waited all this time, we identified the West Coast, which was the Millennium Highway and going down to Columnvet. None of the local companies qualified. I said, to rebuild an existing road? Really?
Was it because of requirements?
Standards.
Standards.
Too high. And then people say, oh, well, he's fighting it because he wants his own contractor to get in. No, local. When Barbados was in its financial problems in the 80s, it was the private sector that turned to the outside, the Cow Williamses and the Goddards and the Cave Shepherds, who then did what? Became regional. I want to see as many of our businesses here become regional. We're not going to succeed if people keep the narrow mindset of just dealing with the local market. That doesn't apply to everybody, but my contractors, my service providers, everybody. And the new tax regime that we've put in place, which is the territorial tax structure, which basically says if you're a business, any income you earn outside of St. Lucia, not taxable in St. Lucia. Now, if that headquarters is in St. Lucia and they're hiring more people and more of that added value is coming back to St. Lucia, that's what I want to see. So those are all contributing parts. Not one thing by itself is going to get you to double or triple the GDP, but it's the collective aggregate of all of those things, and to create a mindset that we can. That is my philosophy, and so that's what I'm saying to you. I didn't come in here to impose Allen Chastanet's philosophy on it. This is well thought out in terms of what is the capacity within the country, what is it we have to be able to achieve to be able to afford the lifestyle that we want, the quality of life that we need to have on a recurrent basis. And so the last thing I would say to you, credit rating. Credit ratings are predominantly driven by per capita debt to GDP. And we're having these long conversations. It's about the debt to GDP, but also more importantly about the ability to service your debt. So our debt to GDP will go up, but as I said to you, the ability to service our debt, not even in question, because they have their own revenue streams, and the monies that we just recently borrowed were 40-year money, 10-year moratorium at 0.5% to be able to meet this huge free capital shortfall. $600 million is what we're projecting in tax revenues that we were supposed to collect this year. We're not. And we're having to replace that by debt. That's the worst kind of borrowing. But in the circumstances, I had no choice. So the question is, how are we going to treat that debt moving forward? Yeah? And so these are some of the significant challenges that we have as a small island development state. It's not just St. Lucia. And the final point I want to make is, if we want to be able to get a credit rating of an A, and there's huge benefits of having a credit rating at A. The cost of money, how the world perceives you, and they go, okay, wow, these are very disciplined people, these are productive people, and that if you maintain it over a period of time, they say, wow, the systems are built in. So it gives a tremendous amount of credibility and confidence to the country. We have to build the reserve somewhere between $400 and $600 million.
Where are we at now?
Not there. We've had to depend on our reserves at the central bank, and I think that it's amazing that we were able to borrow as quickly as we did the amount of money that we have and at the concession rate. Let
me just get this final question in, because I think that it will tie everything that we've spoken about. It will tie this all together. When the economic and social program was presented, not the initial stabilization program, but the medium-term recovery program. I think a lot of people, I think it was your director of finance was the final person to present, and she said something that immediately pricked up my ears. And I said, finally, this is happening. She announced central government's intention to pursue as a policy measure diversification of the economy. And she said that we have finally realized that we are too reliant on tourism and we need to diversify. So everything that you've said to me today, I think feeds into this last question. How are we actually going to achieve that? And I would like you to tell me in as concrete terms as possible. Obviously, this is towards the end of your first term. I know that you are hoping to be re-elected to a second term in office, but that may not happen, right? So how do we as a country pursue a diversification strategy that is going to carry us through a change in administration? You know, what are we putting in place now to allow that to happen? We're still looking at tourism. We're still looking at bananas, right? So how do we begin to make that adjustment?
But that's all diversification. So diversification is not to take your core industry that you're not even coming close to maximizing the opportunity on and saying, I'm not going to do that anymore, and I'm going to do something else. Right now, and meaning the World Bank and the IMF, there is nothing that we have that's going to replace the jobs, the foreign exchange, or the economic impact that tourism is going to do. And as I said to you, 4,500 rooms is a joke, right, in terms of where we are. But what you want to do is to make sure that people are taking advantage of those linkages, and we're taking advantage of all those opportunities. We just spoke about fishes, bananas. I mean, I came in, I'm seeing after all these years, we were still selling 10,000, 12,000 tons of bananas in the UK market, and there was a demand for more. When we met with Sainsbury's and Waitrose, right? All of a sudden there was a change. There was this brand that they called free trade. So it was still generic, and we're still a bit of a commodity. But guess what? There was a demand for St. Lucian bananas. So here's the link. 85,000 British tourists that come here a year. 150,000 British tourists that are on the ships that come to St. Lucia. 250,000 Brits that go to Barbados. 100 and something thousand Brits that go to Antigua. So imagine now if we can get those bananas, our bananas, with a logo, which has been designed, fantastic. That when people are eating those bananas, they're now associating that banana to our logo. And that's the same logo that's going to be in Waitrose and in Sainsbury's. Banana bread. Every day that the guests are going to the hotels, there's a little flag with the logo on it, on the top of it, with the banana bread. Banana coladas, producing banana powder in order to have a banana colada. A banana daiquiri. I'm going to hit you on this one. A banana chocolate rum cake.
Oh, see that?
You know what I'm saying to you? We've got to be able to understand that tourism is the key to diversification. Because we don't have that market here. So imagine if I produced a banana cake and I said, well, we're out of the tourism business. Okay, or we're just going to leave tourism where it's at and we're not going to develop that linkage. Crazy.
So you're saying to me that that what you're thinking about in terms of the strategy is utilizing the value that we already have in tourism and then kind of riffing off of that theme.
Thinking of tourism as a portal to the world. Canadians, North Americans, Brits. What are the products that we're selling? Piggybacking on our diaspora. Core market already. That exports St. Lucia, fantastic job. CMOS comes up, they help with the packaging, and they're getting distributed primarily into your diaspora market. How can we create more byproducts that we can do here in order to be able to expand our output? Because there's not enough people here that are consuming our products to make it successful. And then now getting other persons in other sectors to understand intellectual property right. That's a huge business. That's the orange economy. So, I tease my guys in CAISO. Say, look, writing political songs is good. It's creative. No money. So write your CAISO songs on politics, but also write some CAISO songs that are now talking about an international message. And why did I like Carnival? I like Carnival because it's an industry. It's not an event, it's an industry. So the talent that goes into now designing the costumes, we're going to be spending a significant amount of money on the castries market. Too much product that's being sold in there, not made in St. Lucia. Anybody who's been with me and you speak to, recently we were in Dennery for the opening of the water project. Yeah, and great idea from Wasco was to say, let's give a job to the guys from the Dennery segment to do some songs. Bad sound system, bad stage. That pisses me off. Because that's our product. It should never be. I don't care who it's being played to. We must have greater pride about what is ours and do everything that we can to showcase it. The first year that we did Jeune Creole in Vieux Fort, up at the head, a little 20 by 20 stage, and you had La Rose and La Marque, everybody was squeezed up. I mean, I hit the roof. Said, no, I want you to present them the exact same way that we would present a top talent at the Jazz and Arts Festival. That's what we learned. That's the international standard. And let's make sure that everything that's St. Lucian is packaged, promoted at that same international standard. That's what tourism does for you. It's that portal. If I want to develop my offshore financial services, it is the golf courses, it is the restaurants, it is the accommodation that helps. If I want to have secondary home markets, all that infrastructure is required. If I can fly to more destinations, if I can bring down the price of flying to St. Lucia, the idea of the Headquarters Act that we have in terms of getting more companies to think of having their headquarters in St. Lucia, they all work hand in hand. And I guarantee you that as you start seeing these industries grow, they will become independent. They'll become large enough that they no longer need tourism by themselves because they already have their established markets in North America and in the UK and Europe. Latin America is sitting there. Who even thinks of Latin America? Panama, Majesty, all we do is receive goods from Panama. Who is thinking about saying, do we have products that we can send to Panama to distribute backwards to the rest of the world? This is where we need to take this country. We cannot just think of selling Chairman's and Bounty in St. Lucia. Can't produce enough. And there's so many elements to that. So if you take the distillery as a classic example, it produces rum. But you know they produce another product. Energy. So the heat from the distillery is energy. They can't sell it. So if they had a system in which they could net off their electricity and even sell it, huge revenue. That helps the distillery.
This looks like a lot of policy work.
Correct.
For central government.
Mm-hmm.
Given what you said at the beginning of the interview, what's the time frame for that?
It's continual. The time frame is really to create a structure in which the government understands how to analyze numbers and to look for the opportunities. And it's a changing thing. I mean, if I say to you that the world changes day by day, maybe it's a statement that we said, but it's accurate. There are even sometimes in a day that the changes are so fast. And we have to create a government system that is focused on what the finish line is. And as the world changes, we have to adapt, right? And it has to have the ability to analyze, make a decision, implement, and make sure that those implementations are bought in and delivered by people. Now, if we're not focused on actually growing our economy, generating these resources, but if we're going to have a society that believes that there's a level of entitlement, I'm St. Lucian, and my government is supposed to provide these things for me, regardless of whether they can or not, because I'm entitled to it, we're in trouble. Can't work. Everybody must have a better understanding of how government works, where is the revenue coming from, okay, and what are the policies we have to be able to keep in place. Now, if St. Lucians decide they don't want to be in the tourism business, I'm all for it. But just understand what the economic fallout is going to be from that. So we've had a beautiful opportunity where people are going to the beaches and enjoying themselves, etc. And if in fact we have a higher value for those things, then that needs to come through the system. and say, that's where we're going to go. So government now needs to find other industries to be able to replace that tourism sector. But I would say to you that it's a huge comparative advantage that we have. I would say to you that tourism creates an opportunity for our intellectual property rights and has a tremendous synergy in the orange industry. I think it has huge value to be added in terms of marketing our products, whether it's we're going to produce clothes. The goal is with Carnival that arts and crafts now change. Why is it every year that I don't go to the market and I'm seeing miniature versions of all these beautiful costumes that are being made? Even that little handsets, right? But we need to think that way. Why is it I'm not seeing more creativity with the t-shirts? It's the same Yemen, t-shirt. Where are the pitons? Where's Derek Walcott? Where are all the beautiful sayings that we have? What are the beautiful things that we're doing? How is it we're now embracing Dennery segment as a product? And the same way that reggae was made into an international, and you saw, reggae came out of nowhere, right? It was Chris Blackwell from Island Records who said to Bob Marley and Bunny was not happy about it apparently. I was not there, so I'm just hearing the story. Where Chris said, look, I need to sell you as a rock band. So despite the success you've had in Jamaica and you've had in the diaspora, okay, that's not going to get you anywhere. So the fight was, and that's what Bunny was not in favor of, is Chris put them back on the road to go to the universities. That's how rock bands start. And they were not getting paid. And Bunny said, no, I've done too much. There's no way I'm going to go and play a bunch of white people, etc., blah, blah, blah. And then Bob Marley did continue. And his success was phenomenal. I'm not so sure at the end of it whether he genuinely liked all that success. I think that at the end he felt that not enough black people were getting his music. But you can see that he's wrong. I think black people are encouraged by his music as much today as they ever were before. But the point is that it's how you package it, right? In order for us to be successful in a global market. 180,000 people, Janeka, cannot generate the economic activity to provide solutions with the quality of life that they want unless they're going to change. Are we all prepared to become vegans? So everybody talks about food security. The only way is if everybody decides let's become a vegan. It's going to help with health, yeah? And we would have 100% food security. Do you see that happening?
I don't know, maybe I might be the one holdout.
Okay. In terms of some of the things that we like. So if we want to be totally self-sufficient and we want to live a purist life, then we can do that. But let's then vote on that collectively, and that we're going to bring our services down to the size that we can afford. But if in fact we want more out of life and we recognize, as Sir Arthur Lewis said, right, investment by invitation. And that's why I get upset, again, when members in the society, I'm remembering our rule, criticize foreign investors. That's not fair. Every single political party, every government needs to bring foreign investment in. And as solutions, we need to understand that. And we should never do some of the things that we do to those persons, because the capital investment that's required to drive this investment cannot be borne by government, because then it's going to create a significant amount of risk and debt to GDP to the government. So the government has to do enough to invest in an infrastructure and then encourage both local, regional, and international persons to want to be able to invest. And it's their investment, their intellectual know-how, their capacity to prove a product. Sandals has its own product. Coke Bay has its own product. Jade Mountain has its own product. They're all unique products that are in the marketplace, and that was what we've bought into. We go, wow, that's a great product. We would love to have that here in our country. No differently with Chairman's or any other products. Heineken came in, didn't just produce Heineken, Piton. I wish that Piton beer was being sold more in the region, but the value to us is the same. So where's the finish line? That's the constant question. That's the most difficult thing, and the only thing that we really have in our system currently, Janeka, to determine that finish line is elections. Right? So the government that wins, or the party that wins that forms the government, has a manifesto. And so that manifesto is a referendum. And people don't necessarily agree with everything in the manifesto, but the government doesn't have a way of taking it apart. So that becomes, so the PSs and everybody else now know that this is the policy direction that we're going in. And that's one thing I'm very proud of, is that when you look at the party's manifesto and you look at what we've been doing, for the most part, we've stuck pretty hardcore to it. But that's the only system that we have of determining what the people want. Now you can question and say the number of people participating in the election is going down, and those are very relevant questions, but we just don't have anything yet that is a substitute to what that current system is.
Final question from me, one word answer from you. Given that you said, you know, the manifesto is the standard by which you have judged, given what your manifesto was in 2016 and the work that you have done since that time, have you done enough to secure another term in office?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. We could go on for hours and days, but the dictates of television say that that's all the time that I have. I do hope that maybe we could sit down again, because there are a number of things that I would like to discuss. But for now, we'll have to call it a day. Again, thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure being here.
Thank you.